And as we are live, this is Senate Finance. We are returning from a joint hearing. And this is February 13th. We're going to talk about school construction because we know we have a lot of need out there. We know it's going to factor into any kind of reorganization. If we do nothing, we're going to have to do something to help some of our schools. And so, Senator Bullock was on summer study, so she's going to just kind of give us an info, and then we're going to go to our experts.
The esteemed gentleman behind me. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Chair Cummings. I will just start by saying I've actually been on two groups. I was on the School Construction Aid Task Force, which was 2023 and into 2024. And then I was on the working group this summer. And so I've been at the table talking about school construction for a long time. Before that, I was on the BHS Re-envisioning Committee I was just a parent volunteer who got involved in wanting to build a new high school in Burlington because ours was literally falling apart. And it was not ADA compliant, and the HVAC system was failing, and I could go on and on and on, but you get the picture. It's the situation for many schools in the state of Vermont. So I do believe the esteemed gentleman behind me will talk a little bit about the initial report that came out of the School Construction Aid Task Force, which is really comprehensive. There's a lot of great information in there, including the comprehensive school update report on all of the various facilities across the state. What is going wrong, what is needed, and dollar amounts as well. Big dollar amounts, by the way. And please don't hesitate to stop if you would like to ask me any questions. But as you know, the average age of schools in Vermont is about 61 years plus at this point. We have the second oldest portfolio in the country after Alaska. And this is one of the reasons, honestly, why I ran for office was because it's really a tragedy for a lot of our kids, and something that we need to do something about. We need to face up to it and try to make some headway. So we worked this summer. It was hard because, of course, some of us were in, pretty competitive campaigns that we were involved in, but we tried to carve out as much time as we could to work on this, and we met 6 times, I believe. Aaron Brady was the co-chair with me, and we were tasked with coming up with a bill, which we did, which I would be happy to share with you, or you could look at. But another really important thing that I wanted to mention to you, and I will make copies of this, and I'll make sure Charlotte can put it up on our webpage, is that Representative Brady and I sent out a letter to the chairs of the education committees talking about what we didn't get to, because what we didn't get to is actually almost as important as what we did get to. So I'm going to just quickly name some of the things that we didn't get to that will require someone, looking at some point. We did not get to talking about the look back provision. For example, if we go ahead with a school construction plan, will it include a look back at schools that just renovated or built a year ago, or in the process of doing it now? We didn't really get into talking about what 21st century standards are for school facilities, things like swing space, technology integration, sustainability, safety, accessibility. We didn't get into talking about emergency facilities funding, and if we are to take this work up, this is something that honestly should be done immediately. What's happening right now is that the language around emergency facilities funding is too restrictive. For example, some schools have had really bad mold infestations. Mold is not considered an emergency, but it actually did require students to leave school. And some kids, I think they lost weeks of school last year because of mold. As summers get more humid, it becomes a danger. So that's something that should be looked at as soon as possible. Excess spending thresholds, we didn't have time to really dig into that, but there are some districts that are popping up against their excess spending thresholds. And what does this mean for them? Are they going to be able to build, renovate, so on? And then just a little bit more broadly, what is the capacity of the AOE to implement this plan? They are asking for 3 full-time FTEs. If we were ever to get this off the ground, this is what they would need. The advisory council is something that you will see if we ever do take the bill up and look at it. We wanted the AOE to have some kind of other body that they would be working with to do this work. We didn't want them to have full authority over this project. So we did put in the bill that there would be an advisory council that would be public facing, that would give advice and, you know, various testimony and would work with the Agency of Education on all of this. And lastly, and also very important, we talked about bonus incentives and priorities. So we talked about this yesterday in committee. How would you be prioritized as a school or as a school district if you wanted to build, rebuild, renovate? So is your district a district that would fall in like a poverty threshold? Do you have a mold infestation versus just wanting a new gym? You know, things like that. So where are you on this priority scale? And then we talked about bonus incentives, which is a whole other bucket of work, but something important for us to think about. Any questions before I pass it on to these guys?
Just
Okay, John's going first. Randy has a question.
when you say bonus, could you be more specific about what you mean by bonus?
Yeah, are you guys gonna talk about bonus?
I will. I can answer maybe.
Okay,
Thanks. Thanks, John.
Sure. John Gray of the Legislative Council. So to answer your specific question, the contemplated model we're talking about S39, is that you would have, you know, the way that the current system, which is under a moratorium, works is that you are reliant on state general obligation bonding through the capital bill to fund school construction. So that affects debt capacity for the state. You're running up against CDAC limits. You might affect the credit rating. Like the concept that is implicit but not extensively built out in S39 is that you would switch to a debt service subsidy model. So the way that this would work is that municipalities or school districts trying to pursue school construction would use the Vermont Bond Bank to leverage the resources there to bond on behalf of themselves. And the state would provide a debt service subsidy to those municipalities based on the school construction projects that they pursue. And the way that this would, so it wouldn't have the same impacts on the general obligation bonding, the debt capacity for the state. But the concept is that there would be a base funding amount, and as currently envisioned in the draft, that's providing 20% coverage of the lifetime debt costs for eligible school construction projects, the eligible costs. And then to incentivize particular kinds of projects, you would have bonus incentives, and that would be additional percentage aid that could flow to those districts of an additional 20%. So to say specifically a school construction project that meets none of the bonus incentive criteria would be eligible for 20% coverage of their school construction costs under this proposal. And they could get an additional 20% coverage in state aid through meeting particular conditions. So that's what we mean by the bonus incentives. And it could be things like you get a 5% state aid for pursuing consolidation, or you get additional 5% for addressing energy savings issues. And it would be a way that you could use it's a good policy lever if you want to direct or incentivize particular projects, you can provide varying levels of state aids to those projects on the basis of those bonuses.
Carrots.
Yes, exactly. And the whole program, I should say, because I was asked this question yesterday, it's entirely a carrot system. There's no part of this that is mandating any particular conditions. The conditions, much like an existing law, are applicable, the eligibility criteria and the like are applicable only if you're pursuing state aid. Nothing about this program, at least as currently envisioned, would prevent school districts from otherwise pursuing projects outside of the scope of this program, just as they currently do. That may be a question people start to revisit with the broader conversation of education transformation. But yes, there's nothing about this that mandates particular things.
Sounds complicated, sufficiently.
So I'll offer that I'll do whatever you guys want. I have a presentation that kind of gives some history on school construction and talks about current language and a little bit about policy levers that I'm happy to do. If alternatively you just want me to walk through S39, I can do that as well, but I'm happy to do whatever you guys think would be most useful.
I think the slides might be better, because we don't have S39
Sure.
in this committee. I assume it's in ed.
I think that's right.
So can we get
It
it
will
in here?
come here eventually, but that would probably be.
Can we get it in here? We could get it here. Great.
I don't know how they can do a state bonding thing without us, but maybe they can. And something tells me that depending on, that I like it the other way.
Really?
I want to unmute.
I was trying to true it up the center of the table.
Circle
Okay.
from my screen.
Something tells me as we go through the new school plan, that a lot may change as to how, I keep being told that's what we're going to use to encourage
This will
certain behaviors.
This would be a nice time for me to offer to you guys, maybe not so happy for me, but this is my first time in this committee this session. I am the education finance attorney, so please talk to me about things that you
Okay.
want to do.
That's. Yes.
I definitely want to see this presentation. And one big question I have, which will be overlaid with, I think, this work, if it comes from last year, in this new possible 5-district model or 10-district or in a consolidated model, who owns these school facilities and what is likely to occur with a redistricting of sorts? And how would those communities that may have really dreamt and spent a lot of money on those facilities be at least honored for their investments over the last couple of decades? That's top of mind.
I don't unfortunately know the answers to those questions. I have heard nothing to suggest that the ownership structure as currently works would change as a result of this, but it's clear that the proposal contemplates closures and the like. And so even if the ownership structure wasn't changed by the proposal, functionally, there would be questions as to how do you deal with the loss of those facilities? Is there some way to stand them up in the budget?
So I just want to, when we did Act 46, this was a big issue. And at that time, I chaired the committee in my community that did the sort of merger of all the school districts. And dealing with all of the real estate stuff was actually quite complicated because a lot of the schools at that time, and still are, were owned by the towns. And so transferring the ownership from the towns to the consolidated school district was a big deal. Some of them had deed restrictions and special deals, handshake deals that were made in like 1870. And I mean, seriously, the things about water lines and property boundaries, it was really complicated, and each individual town had different complexities. Things that were gifted to the school. There was a thing about solar in one school and wind and water in another one. It was really, really complicated. So doing the level of redistricting that is contemplated right now, at whatever level, it will be complicated and take a lot of years to sort of iron out. And also exchange of money and liability and debt service. There was a lot of complications on how the debt service transfers from
one entity to another entity and who's responsible for that. So
That's the answer I was expecting.
not easy to do, and just doing it on the smaller scale of Act 46 took a lot of work. Doing it on this larger scale will be huge.
Just my one local school that did get closed, they're using practice school, the community.
Yeah.
But community doesn't feel they can afford the debt, the maintenance cost.
Yeah,
And so you get really small towns. We will have to come up with.
yeah. And one of my towns, there was a shared well, and it was shared between the farm next door and the school, and like having to sort all of that out was really complicated. And then the select board and the school board and, you know, all the things that are involved in it. So it's not an easy prospect.
Not everybody has city water.
Well, there's also the alternative of thinking about at least doing something entirely different. Such that the schools, like other state buildings, are owned by and managed by the Department of Buildings and General Services. Or something similar to that.
Well, just getting there, Senator, will
realize
be
that.
years of complication.
I realize
because of
there are
the
lots of
ownership.
complications, but, you know, again, I think this is a time in which if we're ever gonna think outside the box, we should at least think through it. That may not be the right decision, but it might be the right decision. Who knows?
I'm going to say one more thing, and what I'm getting to is, in my mind, I'm seeing two boxes. I see the education fund formula to pay for operational costs, and I see school construction and this whole tangled web of complexity as managed as a separate program entity and somehow coupled with it, something with what you're describing. So I'm thinking of two boxes.
Yeah. That's the way it's.
I'm still thinking outside both those boxes.
Why don't we let John do his presentation? Maybe he'll answer some of our questions.
Let's start my presentation. But yeah, I agree. There's nothing about the proposed education transformation proposal that assumes that this would be shunted into that framework, the financing pieces don't accommodate it. But let me sprint here and figure out.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
That's not right on a day like
Like
this.
really struggling to figure
You're
out.
using PowerPoint. Everybody uses PDF, but you're in PowerPoint. I appreciate that.
I'm showing how I can't, it's like the Zoom window is like blocking my access to the slideshow.
Shift F5 will get you. Oh, you can.
There we go. It's coming.
Beautiful.
Beautiful. Thank you. I thought about this. You got the right date.
Just keep that nice yellow screen.
I just leave that up there. Yeah. I end with a yellow slide like you happy, but I shouldn't have spoiled the surprise. So historical overview. We have an existing chapter in Title 16 that deals with state aid for capital construction. You'll be familiar that this is under moratorium, aside from the emergency piece, which persists to this day. But just to give context about how that currently works. So this is chapter 123. Back in 1996, this program was created to authorize the treasurer to issue bonds to assist school districts. So that's what we were talking about, that is reliant on general obligation bonding to support this. Requires a two-step application process that requires multiple entity approval. So both the Secretary of Education and the State Board of Education. Something that the working group thought about is this kind of mixed responsibility, like what's going on in that space. Test the state board with prioritizing projects and annually making a funding request to the institutions committees. So as discussed before, this is a process that worked through the capital bill. So the state board would come in with a list of prioritized projects, line items for each, present to the relevant institutions committees, and then make their funding request. The way that aid was awarded, percentage of eligible construction costs based on project type. So you could get different amounts of aid if you met particular conditions, like energy savings might be eligible for quite elevated numbers, which is, I think, what we saw in the early 2000s. Authorize the Secretary of Education to grant aid to emergency projects that's outside the scope of the normal application process that's meant to recognize particular emergent conditions. And then grants rulemaking power to the state board. One key piece that I would note here, and I may have slides later on that address this, but a key section within Title 16, Chapter 123 is a deferred maintenance section. This is a section that says aid is not available if if the reason for the project is significantly attributable to deferred maintenance or significant deferred maintenance, which is something that's built out in the 6000 series by the state board. So they have rulemaking on this. But basically this, if we were operating the program today, we could imagine that that deferred maintenance section would prevent kind of any projects from going through this, assuming that a lot of the problems we can attribute to current facilities arise from deferred maintenance, which is, I think, a fair assumption.
This was really set up for when we were building or expanding schools, not for maintaining the schools. That was seen as something that you did as part of your capital reserve, or however individual schools dealt with it.
Can I just say real quickly, as apropos the slide before, we did take testimony from the state board, about if they had the capacity to take on a new construction, a strand of work. And they did say, they came in and did say that in their current, existence, they do not have the capacity to do the work that would be required for this. So I just want folks to know that.
I don't know who did it, but Wanda Manoli was the guru of school construction. As I was on institutions my first year here, which would have been 97. I may have spent 4 years on there. And we would do that. And then we also shut it down because we had eaten up all the bonding capacity that we had. And that it probably got shut down 98, 99, somewhere in there.
I'll come to this in the
Yeah.
slides because I have some,
Yeah.
law pieces, and then I have like the actual scientists of what happened. This is largely the core of the existing program that's under moratorium, but there are a few pieces added later on. 2001 provisions for career technical education facilities, and in 2003 further provisions to incentivize energy savings for energy performance contracting. You may recall that the aid provisions for this were quite high as percentages, and there are some folks who attribute some of the turmoil that happened in the 2000s to this particular provision. It's not clear to me that actually varying the percentages necessarily results in greater obligations for the state. If you're appropriating particular funds in a year, it would imagine it as restricting the amount of projects that you could authorize rather than increasing state obligations, but something to think about. So in practice, what happened? We ended up with a program that provides construction aid in varying amounts to projects that was determined eligible by the Secretary of Education. So they were checking out eligibility criteria, but then prioritized by the state board, and funds were which appropriated by the legislature following recommendation by the institution committee. So a lot of folks involved in this process. Prior to 2007, the legislature has been spending approximately 20% of total capital funds available, so around 10 million a year. And it also appropriated some one-time general fund revenues to help pay down ongoing obligations from prior construction projects. But as you guys know, the state fell behind on obligations. Fiscal year 2008 reported a state obligation for these projects. So projects that the state had fallen behind on and had not provided funds to the school districts of 74 million. I'm not going to talk through this, but this is from that report, and you can see, in this column here, fiscal year 08. So after some funds have been appropriated to deal with that, roughly 70 million outstanding obligations, you can see that over time it was expected to decline as annual appropriations would be made that's at the bottom there to reduce that figure. So this was a plan to get out of the hole that the state had found itself in. But what it required was a moratorium, and that's what we're still in today. So 2007, Act 52 suspended state aid for most school construction projects with the goal of developing a sustainable plan during the moratorium. At the time, it was envisioned that this was just a really time-limited provision. This could have been a year, could have been 2 years. The idea was to pause and fix it. We're still in that moratorium today. So 2008 extended the suspension, but included measures to ensure school districts could deduct approved spending from their excess spending calculations. We talked a little bit about this earlier, but if you are having to bond locally, you have to fix your schools, and that's going into your education spending. It's raising the local tax rates and the like, and it's raising state rates as a whole. If you got over the excess spending threshold, you could be paying even more heavily in your local rates. So there was a provision introduced to ensure that even though the program was not operating, you could still submit a preliminary application to the secretary to have your costs covered as approved spending, and that would be deducted from your excess spending calculation to protect you from that penalty. In 2009, clarified that a district could proceed with projects using funds besides state aid. That's where we live today. School districts are pursuing school construction projects outside the scope of any state aid program. In 2011, tasked was at the department at the time, but Agency of Education with providing a report on the cost of lifting the moratorium. 2013, intent to maintain the suspension and honor state obligations. The goal line was finally in sight by fiscal year 2016, and then in 2016, finally paid out the last of the hole that the state was in and covered those pre-existing obligations.
So I've had the impression in this political meandering of this topic that now in this current world that we live in, it's really up to the communities that have a will among the voters to approve these construction aids. But I'm just trying to overlay prior to 2007, 2008, how we used to do it. Did the state play more of an active role in targeting dollars to the communities that needed it most and not necessarily the communities with the highest voter approval will to fund new construction?
So I don't honestly know the answer to that. Part of it is a question which gets at something important about any draft that emerges in this space, which is the extent to which there's a statewide unified effort, some hand holding to guide people, technical assistance and the like through the process to ensure that it's not just folks competing over a limited pool of funds and it's just everybody out against each other. I'm assuming that there was at a time, that the Agency of Education did have a program in place and was reaching out to folks to coordinate to some measure these efforts. But I don't honestly know what was happening at that time. I'm sure that it was different than it operates today, where it really is like, can the local voters bear this? Because you can't expect today any sort of state aid. For some of these projects, you could expect 50% aid. You could, the standard base amount was 30%, but for some projects, and you might just be pursuing small fixes, you could receive quite substantial state aid. So I would expect a pretty different environment in that context because you don't need a lot of local appetite to do it if the state is covering a dramatic portion of those costs.
My opinion is not disabused. So I still feel there's a problem with our current environment and that it's really up to the will of the voters in that community.
Sure.
And not necessarily need for our kids.
You're a little concerned with South Burlington.
Yeah.
Post, and that's what it said.
Poor Thomas, you keep walking right into it.
Because it would have fallen into the total of ed spending, which means it would have been divided out amongst all those towns that couldn't afford a gymnasium or stop the leaky roof. So yes, I don't think the moratorium was ever viewed as permanent. It's just, it was there to build schools or expand schools. That need has gone away. And it wasn't there to fix your leaky roof. That was considered general maintenance and it was up to you. But leaky roofs costs hundreds of thousands of dollars and.
For the record, South Burlington soundly defeated that notion.
Yes, you did.
4-1, so.
But it made
Yeah.
everybody around here a little
Yeah, I
nervous.
understand.
Well,
It brought the thing home to us, but then we've got Burlington High School, which no one anticipated needing to replace.
Right, it was supposed to be a renovation, but I can tell you that we passed the $39 million bond well before we were going to renovate the high school for leaky roofs.
Yeah.
We have a lot of old buildings.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, just to give you guys that context.
I think almost every school in the state has a leaky roof from what I've heard. Right, yeah.
But I think it's right to say that the current driver of school construction is local appetite, agnostic as to what need is. I mean, need hopefully function is part of that conversation, but the current driver is local appetite.
Okay,
So today, moratorium continues, but during that, the state has awarded emergency aid up to limited amounts. It's not that substantial. It's 100,000 on the books. But note that, as I was pointing out earlier, no state aid is available to projects arising from significant deferred maintenance. So you can imagine that ruling out lots of things that you might want to support through emergency aid. School districts may pursue construction projects on their own. These projects increase the district's education spending and impact the property taxes across the state. In 2018, the Secretary of Education, you guys authorized to accept applications for planning grants for capital construction that would result in consolidation, but there were no funds put behind that particular effort. And then created a time-limited facilities master plan grant program in 2023 to encourage the development of supervisory union level vision for all school buildings. So this is kind of like regional type thinking. So there's been some efforts in recent years to think about how can we encourage more regional thinking and the like. Current law. I've already kind of hit these points at the beginning, but to point to the way that this currently works, under section 3448, that's our process for school districts to apply, and currently it's not working. So this is just saying what would be happening were the moratorium lifted. School district submits a preliminary application, including information required by rule of the state board, and the secretary will review, consider particular factors like regional economic and educational suitability, and determine whether the application meets eligibility conditions. I can pull up that section if you guys want to see it, but I'm not trying to drown you with information. The school district submits a final application following that, and the state board may approve it if certain specific functional requirements, like do you have fiscal viability in place? Do you have instruction supervision in place? So the second check, the final application, is kind of a functional check rather than a project approval type check. The first part is about, are you doing the kind of project that the chapter is meant to incentivize? And the second part is, do you have these functional constraints in place to ensure that this is worth putting state dollars behind, basically? Following that approval and vote to authorize bonds, the state board puts that school on the priority list by assigning priority points. So you can see something here about where money was incentivized to go, and this is quite different than current discussions about how you might put state dollars toward a vision of how schools should be in the future. Emergency projects over 100,000, projects addressing deterioration of building or equipment over 10,000, and then a point-based system that moved between these two. So even under the old system, the priorities were meant to get at emergency projects. They weren't pushing folks toward a vision of, I would say there wasn't like some holistic vision of how you might be checking this program. As discussed before, the state board makes an annual capital construction funding request to the relevant committees of jurisdictions, your institutions committees. And then here's your actual awards. Most projects were getting 30% of the approved cost, which is not the full cost of a project. This would be things meeting like space parameters and the like. So not the full cost of a project, but if you didn't go above certain space parameters, 30% of that would be covered. You can see this quite high figure for renewable energy projects, 75% of the approved cost, specifically related to the renewable fuel source being used. Consolidation projects were getting 50% if approved before a particular date, and then CTE getting 50% of the approved cost as well. And yeah, only portions of the project meeting space and cost parameters are eligible for construction aid. That percentage is only of the approved cost, so it's a smaller figure than you might think if you were just looking at the dollars for a project. Kind of miscellaneous provisions to know about current law. There's a repayment requirement. So if a school district sells off the school construction project for which it received aid, it's required to refund that amount, but not more than the amount of aid received. It's meant to refund to the percentage that the state aid that they received, but it wouldn't exceed the actual dollar amount that they were granted. And this is something that is not incorporated, although we didn't have active discussions about it, I would say, in 9. So this is something to think about if you want a similar condition, or if this might scare folks away. I'm not sure. Emergency aid, we've talked about grant aid up to a total project cost of 100,000. As mentioned before, the rulemaking governs what constitutes an emergency, and there are some restrictive conditions there that are preventing currently certain projects that you might intuitively think to be emergencies from receiving an emergency.
Your previous slide,
Yes.
you say current law, but there's a moratorium.
Yes.
So none of that is actually happening.
None of this is happening. I just,
Lifted it, that's what would start.
If we look at
Exactly.
the moratorium, that's what we're at.
yep, this is just what's out there. This is the state's old thinking on school construction is maybe the way to think about it.
Which we haven't done in almost 20 years.
State board has rulemaking authority under this proposal, or not proposal, under the old law. school districts do have the ability to appeal. So if they think that they should have received state aid, they could go to their local superior court within 30 days to seek redress. And then we've talked about the deferred maintenance piece, no aid available if the need for the project has arisen from significant deferred maintenance.
Okay, so we're gonna have to, if we're gonna do any state aid, we're gonna have to do some significant rewriting.
Yes, yes. I mean, and that's an easy problem legislatively to solve. You just repeal that particular section. But I'll just say about the bill proposal that you have, or that's not in this room, but that we've been discussing, S39, implicit in the proposal is basically that this would substitute for what's currently on the books. Doesn't currently include repeal provisions, but the idea is that you would pull back the old program and substitute this new program. So recent legislative responses, facilities assessments, 2021, and then 2023, the School Construction Aid Task Force, which produced a wonderful document recommending the new program should be centered on the efficient use of public funds to modernize school infrastructure. So this was helpful guidance for kind of big policy thinking about how the working group would approach its task. The program should use the levers of eligibility, prioritization criteria, and the assurance certification process to drive funding toward desired projects. I'm going to come back to this on a later slide. I have a policy levers slide. But there are ways that you can use statute. There's ways that you can use this program to move dollars and point people toward kinds of projects that you want to have happen. And yes, I will talk more about that. Implementation should prioritize decisions that enshrine continuity of financial and technical resources and laws. So there's some concern that we're just shaking everything up. And this will not be a newsflash to you guys, but if we're just shaking everything up and school districts don't know what's happening, they're expecting all these changes, it's very hard for anyone to begin pursuing any particular project or know how they should proceed. And that so you could have a multi-year gap when people should be moving forward. And recommended that access to school construction funds must include CTE centers. The last recommendation from that task force was to create what became the working group, think through some more of those questions. So this led to Act 149 in 2024. This is the working group from last summer. And the legislative members of that group have introduced a bill in each chamber. That's S39 for you guys, and then H129 in the House. Briefly, I don't have to pull up the full bill to walk you guys through it, but some key provisions of S39. This establishes the new program in the Agency of Education and assigns all this big responsibility, review, rulemaking, and the funding request to the agency. So not having those divided responsibilities between the State Board and the Agency of Education. And I would draw your attention in particular, and I think that Chris may hit this point as well, to the last clause of that first bullet. The annual construction funding request would be made by the agency, would be incorporated in the governor's budget request. So the idea is to get this funding request integrated into that initial request, so you don't have to be fighting post GovRec. The bill additionally stands up a time-limited advisory board that's supposed to help kick off the program to function as a public-facing advisory check on the agency. This would be an exclusively advisory board to help the agency stand up the program, to help guide its rulemaking decision. And in particular, it would, while it would help with all of the agency's duties, there are particular callouts to make sure that the advisory board is making input on the bonus incentives and priority points, which are some of your biggest policy levers for which you could drive projects.
Thank you. I did just want to flag for the committee that we considered making that advisory board an actual governing board. We talked about this a lot. What ultimately I think dissuaded us from going that route was when we looked at what the amount of salaries that folks get who sit on these governing boards. It gave us pause, and so we sort of pivoted to an advisory board instead.
People get paid for sitting on the boards.
Yep.
It's relatively time limited. It's, I think, 6 meetings in the current draft. And there was some concern that if you had, if there's this constraint, you don't want to fund too much of a board, but you give them substantial responsibilities, you might actually be holding up the implementation of the program.
Just for clarity, the advisory board solely is it solely providing advice on school construction and nothing else?
That's correct. Okay. And it's solely advisory. They don't they're not putting anything out.
Sandra,
I'm intrigued by the bullet point on the previous slide, access to school construction funds must include CTE centers.
Hmm.
Could you at all elaborate on what the thinking of was in the?
I honestly don't know from the task force. I'm not sure if you recall why there was a
We just-
focus.
We just didn't want CTEs to be excluded from this program.
And it's worth noting that on the books, there are current provisions for CTE centers in addition to standard school construction projects, but there's a continuity there. Additionally, creates a school construction aid special fund. And part of this was because, you know, that working group and the task force as well, we're not positioned to address the big finance question. So the proposal is agnostic as to what funding sources are going to be, where financing would come for this proposal, but creates a special fund for particular purposes. So awarding aid to school construction projects, that's your classic core of the school construction program. Grants through the facilities master plan grant program. This is a provision that's on existing books, that facilities master plan grant program. And the reason that it's called out here as one of the permissible uses of special fund is that one of the new eligibility conditions that's proposed under this program is to require school districts to go through that master planning process. So this is meant to provide grants to ensure that they can meet that eligibility condition if they have the desire to do so. If you didn't have something like this, only school districts that had the financial capacity to go through the facilities master plan process could meet the eligibility conditions. Special funds could also go to funding for administrative costs and emergency aid. Builds an approval process. It's a two-step process like what we've discussed based on that existing section 3448, but it has new eligibility criteria, and it has the agency with adopting rules to establish new priority points. And we've talked about this at the very beginning, but the proposal here is not that general obligation bonding. It's awarding aid in the form of a debt service subsidy at a base amount, 20% of eligible cost, with up to an additional 20% award available in the form of bonus incentives. And just to make clear, the up to an additional 20%, it's not you get 20 or 40, it's you can have increments between. You might receive 25%, you might receive 30%, depending on how those bonus incentives are developed. And that current vision in the draft is that both priority points and bonus incentives would be built out through rulemaking done by the agency in consultation with that advisory.
Yeah, another question here. I know we've talked about various models of 5 districts, 96 districts or whatever. We've also talked about the notion that who do the schools belong to? Does any of this contemplate that as far as the other 60% of funding that isn't accounted for here? Who's going to pay the rest of it, in other words?
Right. It would still be the municipalities bonding out through the Vermont Bond Bank. So it would be locally raised, that percentage that's not.
And that's assuming that the schools are owned by the municipalities, though, isn't it?
They are municipalities. School districts are
Our school
municipalities.
districts are, okay.
that's probably, just given the new scheme, well, it would go on their school budget costs. They would vote to bond.
No, I think what's the municipality that owns the school? Because if you change the districts, is there also contemplated there are going to be some other changes in terms of that ownership? Though?
Yes.
Right, that's a really good question, because when we bonded in Burlington, we had to obviously go to the city council, get their approval, because it was going to affect the city bond rating.
Mm.
So it was a big deal in that sense.
If you treat schools differently, depending on how you construct it, you may even construct something in which the only bond rating that is affected is the schools or the school districts, as opposed to the rest of the municipality if it's not a municipal function.
Yeah, but they're a separate municipality, which I think they may be, we'll have that St. James conductors. Yeah. Yeah. It was the
Yeah.
supervisory union, so you get someplace like Montpelier, the school district in the city, until they merged with Roxbury, but right now the Roxbury school is sitting in limbo.
Well, I'm just thinking about what's the municipality going to issue, who's going to issue the bond?
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
My sister.
we're gonna have fun. I think you have to decide on what your governance structure is before you're gonna decide on who's gonna issue bonds. I think we're probably getting over the time when the farmer and the school shared a well or a septic system.
Sure.
But I'm also sure that those.
But those are still
agreements
out
are-
there. They're still out there.
We don't have right of way agreements for electric lines everywhere.
Even up in the big city of South Burlington, we had school easements that the developer, the adjacent owner said, you can have that land at under one condition, that it's always a school. And so those conditions exist in South
Yeah.
Burlington, and if we start consolidating, it's gonna get really messy. Which brings me to my previous point. I feel like the foundation formula is one discussion, and then separate alongside that is
Oh, yeah.
construction and the school building conversation.
Yes.
So,
First, we have to decide what kind of governance we're looking at and size, and then we have to talk about how you're gonna pay for everything we envision. I have a feeling the envisioning will be done at the end of the Bar Hall, and that the paying for will be done here, which is usually the way it goes.
Well, one of the issues though is that complicates what Senator Shipman, I think, is raising, is that if you have schools that are owned by an entity different from the agency that's responsible for putting people in schools and using them and using the property, I could see the headbutting coming when one group disagrees with the other as opposed to somebody who's ultimately in charge.
agreed.
I'm sure that the school, if they're building a new, bigger, better school, would like to get top dollar for it. But if the easement says it always has to be a school, that probably won't,
Just one of the many.
Many. can't be more than 2 stories, and yeah. Okay, then there are view easements.
So this is a happy context for the next slide, which is what are things people can usefully talk about and not have to wait on other decision making in the building. So we may not know what's happening in the financing space, but you can think about constructing a program that's meant to push dollars to particular kinds of projects. And that's kind of a classically legislative task, I would say. So some big policy levers, your eligibility conditions, who can actually access state funds. Current law hinges this on meeting specific needs, like is there degradation of the building, is there a threat to health and safety, that you couldn't meet the need by other means, and that the proposed size of the project is suitable for curriculum. S39 proposes new eligibility conditions related to consolidation, district quality standards, and that facilities master planning process that we talked about. But this is a good area where you can control the funnel of state dollars. You can say only school construction projects meeting these particular conditions can get in the door to access state aid. So that's one big policy lever, and that's agnostic as to where the funding comes from. That's something that we can think about. Prioritization points, who has first access to state funds? There may be a bunch of projects out there that are eligible under the conditions of the program, but you're only going to be able to provide certain funds within a year. So who's going to get first access? Current law prioritizes emergency projects, but it doesn't facilitate a particular educational vision. You could, through development of prioritization points, make clear which projects you want to first access state funds. And then lastly, bonus incentives. What kinds of projects does the state want to incentivize through additional aid? I would call out, I got my yellow slide. I would call out that one of the key things about S39 is that both of those tasks, developing priority points and bonus incentives, is assigned to the Agency of Education through rulemaking to develop it. And that's fine if folks want to take that course, but I would call out that you could take a stance, the legislature can take a stance on these things and take articulate a clear direction they would like these programs to go. The extent to which the current proposal does do that, if you do end up looking at S39, is through the first section, the legislative intent section, which constrains the agency's rulemaking authority by calling out particular concerns that the working group thought appropriate for guiding that process. But happy to answer questions, I'm also happy to pull up the bill, but I have used a lot of time, so.
Yeah, I think if and when we get possession of the bill or get into that, first we have to decide what we're going to do. Then we can decide how we're going to implement it, and this will come in with implementing. If we can't do either of the above, then we're gonna have to decide how we're gonna keep some of our schools standing upright. Because as the wife of a roofer, if your roof is leaking, eventually your structure rots. And it just gets more and more expensive to fix it.
That was really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's,
And if you guys, if the legislature elects to pursue a program like this, you'll need to think about how to accommodate, projects that are in the pipeline right now, like how can you, ensuring that continuity.
So which of the 3 yellow doors do we open to find that?
where's the free refrigerator?
No one being biased right now, but I do think that bill should actually be here. It is all money. I don't know. I have not introduced it
It's ed,
and except in here.
You said S39.
It says 39. I assumed it was in education.
did it get on the, was it introduced on the floor?
Okay, well, I have yet to introduce it and
It would go to education. If they're looking at bonded money, it could get sent to institutions. It is not,
be a part of our community.
it could be part of I'm assuming that it would be part of a mega bill that numerous fingers will touch before it's done.
I'll reiterate, I expect to be a large part of that huge bill, so please,
Are you looking for work?
I'm not trying to do that.
No.
There's so much tip stuff going on.
Just on the hotline.
Yeah, this is going to be magnum opus. And everybody is going to have enough to love and enough to hate in it. And we'll do what we need to make progress. Okay, Chris.
Good afternoon, committee. Chris Root, fiscal office. I am going to be very brief. On the committee webpage, you will see a few materials posted under my name, including a slide deck that I have prepared for the working group that met over the fall and for some of the other committees. I am not going to go through that slide deck today. When I look around this table, I see a group of seasoned fiscal veterans who intuitively understand what is in the slides. But I just want to mention for like 5 minutes, a few highlights. And if you have any questions, we can entertain them. The task force report that AOE and the treasurer worked on in 2023 is posted. Also, if you want to read it, something really interesting toward the back is they show a pro forma of sort of what would a hypothetical debt issuance look like at different amounts over a 30-year period with like a 20 or a 40-year subsidy, which is what we're sort of contemplating here. I just wanted to mention a few other key points while I'm sitting here. The report had flagged a need of about $6.2 billion, just based on the current facility footprint that would require a sustained annual investment of $300 million a year. I don't think I am saying anything controversial in this room to say that $300 million a year is not just easily available anywhere.
That one isn't decimal dust.
No, not at all. And as John alluded to, the old program that is under moratorium used the capital budget to fund it. And that is just not going to be a viable path forward on sort of the next iteration, because CDAC, the Capital Debt Affordability Advisory Committee, lowered their debt recommendation from 54 million a year in the last biennium to 50 million a year in the current biennium. So the capital bill is greatly constrained. There's just not a lot of room in there to fund something like this, which I think is why the working group that met in the last year really took a look at the Rhode Island call it the Rhode Island model, where it's a debt service subsidy, where the local school entity would be the one, the municipality would be the ones incurring debt through the bond bank, and then the state, if you will, even though they're all state dollars, would be contributing a subsidy share to help the school pay for a percentage of their debt service payments every year over the course of their amortization schedule.
That would come out of the general fund.
Well, we don't know yet. So,
Unless
but that is
something-
at the end of the day, there was no funding source identified. But what, to your point, Madam Chair, the crux of this whole discussion is how do we shift some of the costs of school construction off of the property tax? That's really what we're talking about here. The bill has a placeholder of creating a special fund to essentially be an accounting mechanism to hold money from some yet as to be determined source that would then pay out from that special fund the awards to the schools for their debt service subsidies. And the draft contemplates that interest that is earned on the balance could be retained in the fund, administrative costs could be eligible. When you think about the current interest rate environment, that is not a trivial matter. I mean, you could, if you're retaining interest on a sizable balance in that special fund, that could offset a lot of your administrative costs.
What are the implications of that to the bond rating?
That is a great question. For the state's bond rating, or which piece? The
Special funds?
Either, any piece.
So the state wouldn't be the ones that would be directly issuing the debt. It would be on the municipalities. So it wouldn't be,
Obligated though.
I don't think we'd be directly obligated, but you would want to hear from the bond bank on that. Yeah, because it's not our general obligation, the way the capital bill is to use the full faith and credit of the state to pay for it. But the draft contemplates creating a special fund as an accounting mechanism. And I think the working group saw value in that because this whole construct really involves some pretty long-term obligations on the part of the state. If you are a school going out to bond for 20 or 30 years, you probably want some assurance that the money is going to be available in order to pay the subsidies that you're banking on in future years. It is a open conversation and decision point as to whether you would want to sort of fund an award upfront. Like if the money tree is flourishing, that would be my preferred alternative because you can put a lot of money in there and maximize your interest earnings. And like the school has some assurance that the money is in that special fund to pay for their debt service subsidies. Fiscal reality might require the legislature to instead fund perhaps on a cash basis. But it's an open conversation. I think very intentionally and while it can be very disappointing to hear, I think the working group showed great wisdom in using their limited time to really focus on what the program would look like rather than figure out where the money would come from, because it's hard to resolve the money question until you first resolve what the program would look like. The working group also didn't have representation from the legislative money committees on it. But I think there's a few different ways you all can, well, it does now, yeah, but there are a few ways I think you all can approach this. And, we often hear the conversation about dedicated revenues. I caution everybody about using quote unquote dedicated revenues to fund priorities because the legislature's primary tool at setting priorities is the appropriations process. And oftentimes when you create a dedicated revenue that goes directly somewhere, it can create distance from that appropriations process. Sometimes those revenues don't keep up with the need. Sometimes it can be difficult for a program to get an audience with the legislature when the limited time is focused on the major funds. Revenue sources behave differently. Some are more economically volatile than others. Something that is a little self-serving, but I want to bring it up because it's important, is that the revenue forecast that we base our budget on focuses on the revenues that flow through the three major funds. So if you chop up revenue sources to go to all these other little funds, that tends to not get captured in the revenue forecast. And it tends to muddy the waters a little bit in terms of you all collectively, your ability to see the full lay of the land and effectively set priorities.
I think we dealt with this with public access television.
I think you frequently deal with this on a lot of issues.
Yeah, but that was a big one because the revenues weren't
Mhm.
there, but they were dedicated.
Yes.
And it was painful to undedicate.
Yes.
And find new things. But it also muddies our
Mhm.
view from the bankers, Wall Street.
It does.
Because, and we undid a lot of those funds. We had that discussion last week, I think, that
Yep.
it didn't look like we had revenue because we had it all. There was the,
And it
what,
can,
the Medicaid, yeah,
you're absolutely right. And it can hinder your ability to effectively set priorities as a legislative body and respond to evolving conditions. So I realize that depending on the issue, that message is received more warmly in some crowds than others, but as a nonpartisan employee of the legislative branch, part of my job is to remind you all of your prerogatives and to be thinking of the big picture. And in that vein, I think the bill that the bills that were introduced in both bodies contemplates that as John alluded to, as part of the governor's budget development process every year, that the Agency of Education would submit a funding request for school construction and have that considered at the onset of the budget development process, because you all are very familiar with how difficult it can be once the budget has been developed to reopen it to put a very sizable new cost in. It is much easier to sort of factor these things in. If it is a priority, it is easier to factor it in as you're putting the budget construct together initially.
you said budget.
Exactly. She's here for Emily is here to spectate for my next section.
Okay.
And
You can have a seat, all right.
so at the end of the day, the way this is structured, and you all can change it however you want, but there's a special fund that's set up and it would be up to the legislature to transfer funds in there somehow. And every year when you do the budget, you'll see an entire section that is interfund transfers.
Okay.
So it is a regular part of doing business of managing the fiscal.
So there is a dedicated fund, but not a dedicated revenue
Correct.
source. So we can put money in or not put money in, depending on,
Need, capacity, priorities, you name it.
all comes down to money. Okay. Questions on this one, because Chris is going to keep going.
I know we're a little over on time, but I would love, maybe not now, better clarity on that $6 billion estimate of the $300 million per year. Is that all equal need, or is that just everything out there that we would do if we had the money?
I would, so that is an excellent question to direct to the agency. I would also encourage, it's a great question, and I would encourage you to read the report that's posted. My understanding is they did a pretty robust inventory of the conditions and needs of our current footprint. And they identified that as sort of the need to replace and address the known needs with the current footprint.
And that will, at some point, the known needs will get meshed up with the new known needs for schools in whatever new governance structure we come up with. So this evening you get to read that report and the state telecom plan. Okay,
And they are substitutable.
yes, our substitute. I was, yeah, they give it John Fisher. All right, so that's it for this, for Route 1. Now we're going to Route.
Yeah, you want me to just keep going?
Keep going.
All right. I'm gonna share my
More
screen.
fun
We're gonna pivot over to the BAA next.
At committee, I wanted Chris to go over this. They're trying to get the BAA out like tomorrow. Technically, we can take it in if, and we will, if we want to make any changes. But if it looks fine. We don't have to hold it up for 4 days, probably by the time it gets here. Gets voted out, gets on the calendar, and so I asked Chris to come over and go through the relevant sections with us, and then we can make a decision about what we want to do.
Sure. So, H 141 is the BAA. It is currently with your colleagues across the hall. They have not concluded their work on it yet, as Senator Cummings mentioned. So what I tried to do here is give you a little cheat sheet that mentions some of the highlights that are pertinent to this committee's jurisdiction. This is not a overview of every single provision in the 70-page bill. This replicates something that I did for the House Ways and Means Committee. And my caveats are just that, like, your colleagues have not finished their work on it yet, so this doesn't reflect any Senate decisions. What I tried to do here was flag in black text what came over in the governor's recommend and show in red where the House made some changes. And I am not going to go through every item. I'm going to bounce around a little bit and draw your attention to some things that I think you might be interested in. And then we can dig deeper into anything that I might gloss over if you've got some questions about that. But I'm willing to take this whichever way you want. The main bill text is also posted on the committee webpage. So I encourage folks to follow along and cross-reference what I'm saying. So the very first item is related thematically, and it has to do with some appropriation changes to the Child Care Financial Assistance Program. The governor had recommended a reduction in the general fund appropriation for CCFAP of, and this is really confusing because we're all dealing with $13 million numbers. Every year we seem to have like the same number show up in a lot of places, but that first $13.082 million reduction in the general fund appropriation was proposed due to reduced caseload expectations in the current fiscal year because things are just ramping up. The second $13 million thing, that 13.2, that has to do with shifting 13.2 million of costs off of the general fund and onto the child care contribution special fund. And the thinking behind that was that the revenue forecast for the payroll tax was upgraded this year. So there will hopefully be a little more revenue capacity within the special fund to absorb that cost and otherwise shift it off the general fund. The House had concurred in that, but the House also made two additions. The Section 79 and Section 80. Section 79, the House had added language that would allow the existing human services caseload reserve, which has over $90 million in it, to be one avenue that CCFAP could use to reserve against, to make sure that there aren't any deficits in the CCFAP program if there are utilization costs higher than expected. And on a similar vein, Section 80 established legislative intent that if there's an unreserved and unallocated balance remaining in the special fund at the end of the year, that balance remain in that fund to support the future establishment of a reserve within that special fund itself. The language does not create its own reserve. This is something that we looked at with the treasurer and finance and management as part of a report that the legislature required on our reserve practices overall. And I think where we landed was there's not a lot of experience yet in the program to really know what is the right amount of money to set as a reserve or like how to structure it. But until we have a little more experience under our belt and have a little more clarity on that, as an interim step, the Human Services Caseload Reserve could be used as one way to reserve against the CCFAP program, and that there's intent that whatever balance that remains in that special fund essentially stay there to help serve that future purpose.
Okay, so we're not shorting.
This has no impact whatsoever on who can receive benefits or the
Right.
structure of the
We're not
benefits.
cutting benefits. It's just that we're doing better with the payroll tax, so there's more money, so we don't need.
Yeah, the forecast is upgrade. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't think we need to transfer 13 million in general fund in. But we've got the caseload reserve in case, because this is still a system that is creating itself. We need to have private childcare centers taking advantage and opening, and that takes some time. So we're protecting the program. We're freeing up $13 million in general fund this year.
Yeah, since this is an entitlement program, I think there's just some concern that, you know, if utilization is really high and if there were to run a deficit in that special fund, would that expose the general fund or other funds to, you know, the need to backstop that? So I think there was a desire to create a mechanism to allow for a reserve there just to buffer and protect that entitlement program.
And it's not to deny parents they won't run out of money, so you can't go to work because there's no childcare. Might not be any childcare, but there's some money there. Yeah, you can find a slot. All right. Question.
Okay, no, go ahead. I'm sorry. I thought you were skipping over the next one.
Oh, I was just
I had
gonna, I
questions.
was gonna stop real quick on it, not skip over. There was section 40 is highlighted in red. This is a reduction in, the reason why it's highlighted in red is that this wasn't a House initiative. This was actually contained in the FY26 GovRec big bill. The House, however, decided to pull it in to the BAA since it changed FY25 appropriations. So if that sounds confusing, every year in the budget, there is a section that makes changes to the current year in addition to the appropriations for next year.
Right.
So this was in, as the governor proposed his FY26 budget, this was a recommended change that would impact FY25. So the House just essentially pulled it into the BAA since it was impacting the current year budget. There was a $1 million appropriation reduction in state placed students. And then the next sections 41 and 42, which the House made no changes to, there was increased demand for the adult diploma program. These costs are split 60% to the general fund, 40% to the education fund. So the governor had proposed increasing those appropriations and the House agreed. And that is the extent of my knowledge on these programs, because I am not an education expert.
All right, but if the 1 million came in, it's in the budget. They put it in this year because.
The BAA,
Yeah,
They just moved it
BAA,
over.
because that 1 million will go out to schools this year.
Yeah.
So it's in there.
Yeah.
And then the adult literacy, they're just moving things within that program.
Yeah, there was increased demand for the adult diploma program.
Okay,
So those costs are split 60% from the general fund and 40% from the ed fund. So that's what that cost share.
okay,
shares.
so this is responding to increased demand out there. It's
Yeah,
money.
and this was a governor's recommend.
Okay.
The House made no changes.
Then how do you?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to flag this. There were some changes done in the adult diploma program last year that I don't quite understand, but I have some very concerned constituents about it who are not happy with the changes that were made. I'm glad to see they're fully funding this, but this is one of those areas as we're thinking about things that are being paid for by the education fund that maybe shouldn't be or could not be paid for by the education fund, because these are expenses that are above and beyond K-12 education expenses that are coming out of property taxes. This is adult education. And so this is just one of many things that are on the ed fund that are sort of beyond the scope of what the ed fund was originally created for, as one of the sort of scope creeps that has happened over the years. And as a result, has been part of why property taxes have gone up. So just flagging this for people to.
All right, this is just funding it for this.
No, I understand that, but this
But
is
we
just
will-
an,
yeah.
you know, this is,
But it is, and
it's in, you know, and
Ed fund.
it's in the ed fund and it's on the property tax, and that's a thing that we should be thinking about. There are a lot of
We probably need to look, because that kind of detail is not generally on the spreadsheet, I think we get.
State place students.
State place students is, this is adult diploma,
It's a whole separate program
yeah.
and it's
We
a.
don't have the high school of Vermont anymore. But this is the GE, is this GED?
No,
No,
different thing.
it's a
And they
different
just
thing.
made some pretty substantial changes.
okay,
yes.
so let me see if we can take a look at.
Community high school, Vermont's over the general fund.
That was one of the, I think that went there and we got the pension, the present pension,
The normal cost.
the normal cost.
And we got all the sales tax.
Okay,
All right, keep rolling.
April.
Page 2, there are some appropriation reductions that impact the education fund that the governor proposed and the House concurred with. That first item in section 43 is an $11 million reduction. That essentially reflects the fact that since the yield was calculated in the bill that passed, some school budgets that passed came in at slightly lower amounts. So the $8 million of appropriation reduction reflects lower school budgets coming in. $3
Last
million,
year.
yeah, and $3 million is reduced to the appropriation for English language learners because I believe there was an accidental duplicate appropriation that occurred, and this is some housekeeping.
And is that the money that showed up in the ed fund that kept us from being in a $10 million hole?
I don't know.
Julie at one point said that, because I was anticipating, we used $10 million in one-time money. And I was anticipating that we would start out in a hole. No, he's more, he's 70 million. And she said, no, there'd been reversions in school.
That's right.
budgets
Yeah,
come in. And so,
we're gonna get to that. Yeah,
okay,
yeah,
we aren't in a hole.
yeah. So section 44 is another appropriation reduction that relates to universal meals. Actual costs came in a little lower than expected, so you see that reflected. I'm gonna get back to ed fund stuff,
Okay.
but this is in chronological order
Yeah.
somewhat of the bill, so.
44, 51.
Yeah, I'm gonna switch gears real quick and go to the property transfer tax. If you remember, there were,
Playing with it.
yeah, there were two bills that passed, that had to do with the PTT last year. The budget was Act 113 and the Housing and Act 250 bill was, Act 181. There was language in the BAA to sort of harmonize and make the appropriations from the PTT in both of those bills coherent. The language that came over in the governor's recommend would, I should say that all of this has to do with the $1.279 billion of additional PTT that flows through the municipal and regional planning fund. My colleague Ted Barnett did a memo for your colleagues in the other body that gives some more context behind this, and it's posted on the committee webpage if you want to dive down this rabbit hole. But statute says that 70% of the money goes to regional planning, 20 to municipal planning, and 10 to the Vermont Center for Geographic Information. The governor's recommend had applied those statutory allocations to that additional 1.279. However, that resulted in an actual reduction in funding for regional planning. What the House instead did was apply the same percentage allocations that they used in Act 113 in the big bill to the additional 1.279 that came through Act 181. So those are the percentages that were in the big bill: 82.4 for regional planning, 12 for municipal planning, and 5.6 to the Vermont Center for Geographic Information. This allocation makes everything consistent with what you did in the budget, and it results in all three of those functions getting more money. So under the
Okay.
construct, if you were to apply the statutory 70-20-10, regional planning would have actually received less money. So that was the thought process in the other body.
Okay.
I am now going to pivot to a lot of really mundane things in the transfer section in section 52. But since these impact revenues into or out of the general fund, I thought the committee might be interested in doing a quick walkthrough since it's revenue related. The first one, the transfer from the Cannabis Regulation Fund to the general fund was upgraded by $3.4 million. And that just reflects the actual amount that was available to be transferred. 30% of that money is earmarked for substance use prevention, and you will see that increased in the appropriation in E313. Sports Wagering Enterprise Fund was downgraded a little bit. The budget had initially hoped that $7 million would come in, and this downgraded it to just over 6.1. This is still a relatively new program that is still ramping up. This adjustment just reflects some, more accurately reflect the expectations of what is going to be available.
Okay, I'll ask what they asked last year when I was in the committee of jurisdiction. Does that reflect the Super Bowl?
It does not. This happened prior.
It reflects once over.
Yeah, it reflects last year's.
Yeah,
Last year's Super
yeah,
Bowl.
but not the current, not
It
the
doesn't
current.
reflect how much I made on this year's
No.
Yeah. But betting for the Eagles, right?
twice.
The
Philadelphia.
Go Birds. The Liquor Control Fund, that direct app was downgraded by a little over $11 million. It turns out the Liquor Control Enterprise Fund had been running a bit of a deficit from year to year. A little more money has been swept out than was available. Liquor sales are starting to go down a little bit, and obviously costs are going up. So the direct app was reduced because had it remained at the 21.1, the Liquor Control Fund would have ended the year yet again with a pretty sizable deficit. So this reduction would bring the Liquor Control Enterprise Fund into a projected zero balance at the close of the year. So this sort of fits in the theme of a lot of times in the budget, you'll see transfers to true up and resolve deficits in various funds. It's not a good accounting practice to be running a deficit in an enterprise fund. So your colleagues in the other body took some extensive testimony from Liquor and Lottery on this, but and they
So you
all
should drink more and smoke more.
or
Is that
at least purchase more.
purchase more. Don't drink it, just put it on the shelf.
I don't care what you do with it, Madam Chair.
I wonder if that is coming out of COVID where apparently people shut up in their apartments.
I think there's been a trend nationwide where liquor sales are starting to soften a little bit. Cannabis sales have obviously been exceeding expectations. There
Okay.
likely is some purchasing shift.
Okay,
Um,
because I was getting complaints that they couldn't get liquor for the new trend in exotic cocktails. Cocktails and hard liquor were coming back in as opposed, and we've seen a shakeout in the craft brew industry.
Yeah, there's a lot of dynamics going on.
Yeah,
The next few are somewhat straightforward also. The Tobacco Litigation Settlement Fund, the budget had called for transferring $3 million from that settlement fund into the general fund.
yeah.
Turns out that if you were to do that, it would lead to a $1.6 million anticipated deficit in the Tobacco Litigation Settlement Fund at the end of the year. I think projections have changed as to what was expected to go into that fund over the course of the year and what would be available. The administration had proposed and the House concurred with just striking that transfer, avoiding the prospect of running that fund into a deficit, because quite frankly, the general fund doesn't need the $3 million.
Okay.
The next one, the WET fund, the Workforce Education and Training Fund. This is an obsolete special fund, and the administration is proposing that the residual balance of just under $2.6 million be swept into the general fund, and then have the language that created the WET fund get rid of the fund. So you'll see that a little bit later in the BAA.
We aren't using that fund anymore.
No, my
That
understanding-
credit's gone.
My understanding is that this goes back quite some time, and the activities that the special fund used to pay for are now funded through the Department of Labor's base
I
appropriations.
think I would have remembered what the wet fund.
Yeah. This is some accounting cleanup.
Okay. cleaning it up.
Another, on a similar theme, the Traumatic Brain Injury Fund has been dormant for quite some time. The administration is proposing, and the House agreed, that that fund be abolished and the residual balance at the end of the fiscal year be swept into the general fund. We expect that will be about $1,500. It's mostly just accumulated interest. I think this fund received one transfer of $140,000 in 2008. That money's long since been spent.
Alright,
The next one is an upgrade from unclaimed property. That's often welcome news. There's more money available to be swept into the general fund than the budget had contemplated. So just under $4.5 million will be coming in from that. The DFR special funds, there's a reduction in that direct app of $3.4 million. That's just due to some revised projections from DFR, where they revised some of the original estimates. They reconsidered some of their growth rate assumptions and sharpened their pencils and came back thinking that we would have a little bit less money available this year. So this is essentially rebasing the original estimates that were used in building the budget to what we more realistically expect will happen. So,
yeah. We've been tapping that.
yep. So those are the transfers. There's a few reversions here, and just to remind the committee, reversions represent appropriations authority that are no longer needed for their originally intended purpose. So the reversion is essentially sending that spending authority back to the fund that it came from to make it available to you all to reappropriate. So this is a very common course of business type of thing. The tax department has just over $7 million of general fund reversions, and they can come in and walk through if you really want to dig into any one of these lines. But some of these just have to do with some vacancy savings. They received some money to hire positions that they didn't all need in the first year for standing up the childcare contribution. And there's just some other areas where they found some savings and they no longer needed that spending authority. There are, on a similar vein, but we're talking about the ed fund now and not the general fund.
Okay.
There's $24.3 million of reversions, and you can see where they're coming from. And I think, Madam Chair, this goes back to your
Picked up
comments.
some money.
Yeah, every year there's some reversions, there's some appropriation reductions. There's
Million
filling out.
from Universal School Meals.
Yep. So you'll see where those savings showed up, and if you want to drill into the specifics of any of these, I suggest
Paid by students, so that's, all right.
and these were my understanding is these were factored into the December one. So this is not,
That's what I was,
this is not a surprise. This was
by law, this was all factored in. So we don't have it to spend, it's been spent.
I'm sorry.
Oh, well.
The next one might be of interest to the committee. You remember that bill you did last year, Act 145, that made a lot of changes to the telephone taxes?
Yeah, it's 181.
Yeah, without rehashing this whole bill, because it had a long history. It involved repealing the telephone personal property tax and instead taxing communications property on the grand list. Things were set to take effect this year. There was an effective date that would take effect in April. Turns out the tax department needs more time to bring a vendor on to deal with the very complicated work of valuing the special property on the grand list. So they're proposing that the effective dates just be bumped out a year to make sure that they have some more time to do that work. Why this is in the EAA and not in the big bill is because there was an effective date in April of this year. So this needs to get resolved ideally before you. And this frees up a tiny bit more
We're gonna
money.
have trouble when we did bill and we tried.
Yeah.
It was even more complex when we started. Okay, so that shouldn't be a surprise.
This is literally just bumping the dates out by a year. So section 65 is takes up a lot of space in the bill, but it's very technical amendments that amend the yield bill last year related to overpayments of education taxes in the Northeast Kingdom up in Essex County. As the bill was originally written, the refunds for overpayments were distributed on a town basis. Turns out that's unworkable. So instead, the money is being channeled to the school district to then go out to the taxpayers. So this is not a material change in the refunds. It's just channeling it through the Northeast Kingdom Choice District rather than to all the individual towns.
Wait, thank you. When you say education taxes, you mean property
Yes,
taxes?
yes.
Okay, thank you.
Didn't this happen last year too?
Yeah, so this language was in the yield bill last year, but it
That's
was
what I thought.
constructed in a way where all the money went to the towns. So instead, the money needs to go to the Northeast Kingdom Choice District to
Okay.
then go out.
It's like,
So,
this seems like a deja vu thing.
yep, yeah, it should feel familiar because
Okay.
you already dealt with it. It's just, there needs to be an
It
alternate.
didn't work the way we did it, so
Yep.
now we're redoing it.
And it takes up a lot of space, but it's not a new, shift. You'll see the repeal of the wet fund that we just talked about in section 69. There is a really small matter relating to the tobacco trust fund in section 70, which I don't want to dwell on.
Corrections,
I'm sorry.
grammatical corrections.
Yeah, so I think one of the things in here was the statute had required a transfer from the fund that the legislature had commonly not withstood. And the recommendation is to, like, instead of doing that, remove the requirement of the transfer. And if you all need to transfer money, just do it.
We'll decide to do
Yeah,
it.
rather than like have something in statute that you're then notwithstanding, just do it if you need to do it.
Okay.
Section 71, I know you all have some interest in utilities. This is an extremely uninteresting thing in the bill, but I flagged it that last year there was an extension of the time frame that the excavators were allowed to do. This is in the miscellaneous PUC
You
bill.
would dig say.
Exactly.
All right.
And the timeframes were extended from 48 to 72 hours, but they were unintentionally not extended for the marking process. So you don't want a situation where like people are digging before the utilities are marked. So this change just makes everything in alignment that it's 72 hours for the digging.
Okay,
The only reason I flag that is you all have interest in utilities.
We do.
So there it is. 77 repeals that obsolete traumatic brain injury fund. And my last thing I wanted to draw attention to was the House added in section 85, a repeal of the sunset on marriage license fees.
okay, I was gonna say, isn't there?
Yeah, there it
in
is.
Somewhere.
So you all will remember that 2 years ago, you passed a law that had to do with removing driver's license suspensions due solely for failure to pay amounts due within 30
I think we
days.
had 30,000 Vermonters driving with licenses.
Oh, yeah.
So this change did not remove people's financial responsibility. It didn't change anything related to safety violations. It just meant that if you didn't fully pay the amounts due within 30 days, you couldn't have your license suspended due solely for the failure to pay amounts due.
Wait,
There
I
was.
thought we were talking about marriage license here.
I'm gonna get to that.
Yeah,
Oh,
there
okay.
was
There-
a time.
It's a
I'm gonna-
marriage license.
I'm
We're
gonna-
talking about driver's
I'm giving you the
license.
context
Yeah.
for why this was in that bill. So a big source of funding for the domestic and sexual violence special fund is a portion of the $47 surcharge on moving violations. And there was some concern that shifting the policy around driver's license suspensions could alter people's behavior in terms of delinquency or making timely payments. There was concern that that could adversely impact the timing of collections to some of these funds that receive that surcharge money. One way that you all addressed that concern was you looked at the second major source of revenue to the domestic and sexual violence special fund, which is a piece of marriage license fees. So you all, for a 2-year period, increased the fee on marriage licenses from $60 to $80 and dedicated $15 of that increase to the domestic and sexual violence special fund, the other $5 of the $20 increase to the town clerks. this will expire absent any legislative action at the end of this fiscal year. If that happens, the license fee will revert back to $60. The domestic and sexual violence special fund would then lose $15 from each license that they're currently receiving, and that will cost them about $72,000 a year on average.
Little history on this. There was a time where different advocacy groups found we'll just put a $5 fee, we'll put a $10 fee on traffic violations, to the point where people couldn't pay their traffic violations because we had a couple $100 on them. And if you remember last year, we were talking about a pole attachment or an attachment fee, and the chair was said, no, that just opens the can of worms. It's coming out of this experience where it just looked like an easy, and it's just $5 more, and it's a great fund.
It's called Driving While Married.
Yeah. So, but this has been an attempt to fund those without putting it into the general or state offers.
But this change moved it from a driving thing to the marriage.
Well, they're
license,
both,
which-
they're still both there.
They're still both there.
Yes.
Okay. But unfortunately, the marriage license
It's also-
connection actually makes sense.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's my question. So this creates an association relationship between getting married and domestic violence. But I think domestic violence is often among roommates or love partners that are just living together, or boyfriend, girlfriend. Why is it? I definitely support getting the $72,000, but I'd rather take it from the liquor funds. I don't feel like penalizing marriage.
That's a good idea too.
Just getting married, I don't think needs to shoulder the
And
cost.
no one
of
will
domestic
remember how
violence.
this all
I think
happened
it's-
once those of us who were here at the time left the committee, and they'll say, why did these people do this?
I remember raising actual concerns because this doesn't seem like a rational assessment.
I think that there is a connection because it's domestic violence. It used to be, actually referred to as spousal violence or, whatever. And I think, but I agree, like the alcohol connection might be an even bigger connection, and,
We
we just
can
need to
look
have a
at
plan, ways
that.
to fund it.
But
But
this
choose my battle.
just means
$72,000.
keeps everything as it is for now.
Correct.
If we have a philosophical feeling that we should change that source, we can do that. We will get a miscellaneous tax bill, which this committee and this chair traditionally love to decorate. And that would fit on there. So we could have that discussion and we don't have to.
And if I may, Madam Chair, to sort of connect this to what I was talking about in the previous slide, I think you all could also have a conversation of if these are very important public safety programs, do they need to be funded through dedicated revenue sources that might not keep up with the demands on the program? Or is this a candidate for consideration for funding from the general fund as part of the overall budget?
And I think this happened like during the Great Recession, and there was no extra money floating around.
Clarifying question, thank you, Madam Chair. The 72,000 is coming just from the marriage license fee or from both marriage and?
This just represents the $15 from the marriage license fee. So the total fund gets just under, I think it got just under 600,000 of revenue from all sources in FY24. And their two major revenue sources are a cut from marriage licenses, which it's currently $50 of the 80. And if the fee reverts back, that will go down to $35 of the 60. And the other piece is, I believe they get like $13.50 from the $47 judicial surcharge on traffic tickets and criminal and civil violations.
Thank you.
You're doing a wedding. This is Chuck.
This is likely the least expensive part of it.
You got your more for candy dollars.
Those are the highlights in the VA.
So committee. Think about it. my intention, I don't see anything in here unless we want to fight over domestic violence and should it be tied to marriage license. That we really need to hold up BAA on. We've got the budget coming if we wanna.
Fight about things.
Yeah, if you wanna fight about things, we'll have ample opportunity. And I will ask the Secretary of the Senate if he can draft a script for me saying we don't need to take.
Well, I mean, you can ask. Off the, but is there, I'll just forget it. I'll ask Chris offline. Sorry. I don't need to.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
This went smoothly,
We
except
tried.
for the fear and trepidation over school construction.
Exciting. Our team can't wait to build schools.
Okay, that is it for